Prison sensory deprivation, the brain torture method that destroys minds, documentary. What happens to the human mind when the world goes silent? When sight, sound, and time itself disappear, and the only thing left is your own thoughts, echoing in the dark? Neuroscientists say the brain is built to receive the world. But what happens when the world is taken away? Today, we uncover one of the most extreme forms of psychological pressure ever documented, sensory-restricted environments inside American prisons, and what happens to the brain when human senses are pushed beyond their limits. And the truth is far more unsettling than anyone expected. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. Stick around. By the end of this video, you'll see the mind like you've never imagined it, and why this story matters more than you think. Subscribe now to follow along. Prison sensory deprivation, the brain torture method that destroys minds. When the human mind has nothing to hold on to. For decades, researchers at institutions like the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Justice have studied what happens during extreme sensory reduction. The findings are consistent and undeniable. The brain begins searching desperately for input. Neural pathways fire in unusual patterns. Reality becomes unstable. Perception bends inward. Psychologist Dr. John Zubek's laboratory studies, which placed volunteers into controlled sensory-limited rooms, revealed something astonishing. Within just a few days, the mind begins to drift away from reality. Participants described vivid visual images, distorted sounds, floating sensations, and an overwhelming confusion about time. And these were healthy volunteers, monitored in safe, controlled research settings, with the freedom to stop at any moment. Now imagine being unable to step out. The prison environments that change the brain. Across multiple public reports, including those from the American Civil Liberties Union and the Vera Institute of Justice, concerns have been raised about certain high-security environments where individuals spend long periods with minimal sound-restricted movement, little visual stimulation, and almost no social contact. In these conditions, researchers say the human brain begins adapting, and not always in healthy ways. Neuroscience studies show that when the senses are drastically reduced, the prefrontal cortex becomes less active, emotional regulation becomes harder, and the brain begins generating internal imagery to replace missing sensory input. This is where hallucinations, intense fear, and cognitive confusion can appear, not as signs of weakness, but as predictable neurological reactions. The brain simply wasn't built for emptiness. The mind starts creating its own world. Inside an environment with almost no sensory feedback, researchers describe a phenomenon known as perceptual substitution. When the brain can't rely on sight, sound, or touch, it starts creating its own internal signals. A former research participant once described it like this: "My thoughts became louder than the room itself." Another explained, "It felt like my brain was trying to fill the silence." Peer-reviewed studies from the Journal of Psychological Science show that people in extreme sensory-limited settings often experience intense imagery, distorted perceptions, emotional instability, and time disorientation. The brain's reality engine begins to malfunction, simply because it no longer knows what is real. Inside the cell, a different kind of pressure. While researchers tested these effects in controlled labs, public reports show that some correctional environments can replicate similar sensory conditions unintentionally through isolation, stillness, and restricted stimulation. Imagine sitting in a quiet cell where the lights barely change, the walls never move, footsteps are rare, and your world shrinks to a few square feet. Day after day, week after week, human rights organizations have documented the emotional toll individuals can experience in these environments. Heightened anxiety, emotional numbness, internal panic, long-lasting stress. Not because of violence, not because of physical harm, but because the human mind is wired for connection and begins to struggle without it. When the brain begins to unravel. Neuroscientists have a phrase for what happens during long periods of sensory restriction. Cognitive drift. It's not dramatic at first. It starts quietly, almost invisibly. a missed thought, a moment of confusion, a memory that feels softer around the edges. But inside the brain, the change is far more real. Studies from major neurological research institutions show that when sensory input drops too low, the brain's communication pathways begin to weaken. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and emotional balance, becomes less active. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the center of fear and stress, becomes more sensitive. It's a neurological tug-of-war. In interviews documented by researchers, individuals who spent long periods in sensory-restricted environments described moments where reality began slipping. I couldn't remember if a thought was real or imagined. I heard sounds that I can't explain. Time didn't feel like time anymore. This isn't imagination, it's science. When the brain can't rely on sensory input, it begins generating its own internal world. A world the person can't always separate from reality. And once that process begins, even small moments of silence can feel overwhelming. Why the brain can't survive the silence? Silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of orientation, of reference, of anchor points the brain needs to know where it is in time and space. Neuroscientists often explain it this way: the brain is a prediction machine. Every second of your life, it is comparing what you sense with what you expect. That's how you stay grounded. That's how you stay you. But inside an environment with almost no sensory input, that entire system breaks down. The brain suddenly has nothing to measure, nothing to compare, nothing to interpret. And so, to survive, it begins creating its own signals. Researchers describe this as the mind turning inward. But for many individuals, it feels more like the world collapsing inward. In controlled laboratory studies, volunteers placed in sensory-limited rooms often reported a strikingly similar progression. Hour 1. The silence feels unusual but manageable. Hour 6. Thoughts become louder. The brain starts amplifying internal noise to replace the missing external world. Hour 12. Emotion and memory begin blending together. People start losing track of whether they've been inside for minutes or hours. The internal images appear spontaneously, not dreams, not hallucinations, but something in between. Light flashes. Shapes drift. Voices echo faintly. Day 3 and beyond. A full psychological shift. The brain's grip on reality loosens. Internal and external worlds begin competing for attention. And remember, these were healthy, well-rested volunteers under supervision who could quit at any moment. Now imagine someone in an isolated, quiet cell where conversations are rare, visual stimulation barely exists, footsteps come randomly, and the day has no real markers of time. For the human brain, this isn't simply uncomfortable, it's disorienting at a biological level. Neuroscience studies show reduced activity in the parts of the brain responsible for planning, emotional control, social understanding, and even basic sensory prediction. Meanwhile, the regions linked to fear and stress become hyperactive, trying desperately to interpret the silence. This is why individuals in extreme sensory-limited environments often describe a unique kind of panic, not fear of danger, but fear of nothingness itself. The empty room becomes a mirror, reflecting only the mind back at itself. And without the world to hold on to, the mind begins to feel like it's slipping through its own fingers. The human experience, living inside the void. So what does it actually feel like to exist in a world where almost nothing reaches your senses? Publicly available reports and expert analyses, including those from the American Civil Liberties Union and the Vera Institute of Justice, provide insight into the profound human impact of extreme sensory-restricted environments. While the studies cannot speak for every individual, patterns emerge, patterns that neuroscience helps explain. Imagine stepping into a room so silent, so visually blank, that the brain has nothing to process except itself. The walls don't change. The air feels motionless. Time seems to stretch and compress unpredictably. Day becomes night becomes day again, but you have no way of knowing. Every small sensation, the faint buzz of a fluorescent light, the tiniest draft of air, begins to dominate your awareness. Your own heartbeat becomes an overwhelming sound. According to research from the Journal of Psychological Science, this is where perceptual substitution occurs. The brain, starved of external input, generates its own images, sounds, and sensations. Hallucinations are not anomalies. They are a predictable neurological response to deprivation. People report seeing shapes or shadows that aren't there, hearing faint footsteps or voices that do not exist, feeling movement or touch where nothing occurs. These experiences are not signs of weakness or imagination. They are direct consequences of how the brain processes sensory information when deprived of the outside world. Long-term exposure, even for just days or weeks, can leave enduring impressions. Studies show that individuals often struggle with emotional instability, memory difficulties, heightened anxiety, persistent disorientation. The psychological toll is compounded by the absence of social contact. Humans are inherently social beings. Conversations, laughter, even shared silence serve as critical sensory anchors. Remove them, and the brain loses essential markers that help define reality and maintain emotional balance. Former participants in controlled studies, who volunteered for sensory-restricted experiments, describe an eerie similarity to these prison conditions. After hours, I began questioning whether I had imagined my own thoughts. Every memory felt borrowed. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. The silence became heavier than any sound I've ever heard. It wasn't peaceful, it was pressing, like it was trying to squeeze something out of me. And the science supports their experiences. Functional MRI studies reveal that under sensory deprivation, the brain's default mode network, responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and internal thought, becomes hyperactive. Neural circuits fire erratically as the brain tries to generate input from within, creating a feedback loop that magnifies confusion and stress. The result is a unique psychological landscape, one where reality, memory, and imagination blur, leaving the mind trapped in a labyrinth of its own making. This is the lived reality inside environments designed, intentionally or unintentionally, to severely limit sensory stimulation. And it's not just theory, it's what documented reports describe. People don't just feel bored or lonely in these cells, they begin to feel as if their own mind is the only world that exists. Long-term impacts, when the mind doesn't recover. The question many ask is simple: what happens after someone leaves these extreme sensory-limited environments? Neuroscience and psychology provide clear answers, though they are unsettling. Even after returning to normal surroundings, the brain often struggles to readjust. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, attention, and emotional regulation, may continue to function differently for weeks or months. Emotional reactions can be amplified, memory may become less reliable, and anxiety can persist long after the individual leaves the cell. Reports from human rights organizations and longitudinal studies indicate recurring patterns in people who have experienced extreme isolation or sensory restriction. Persistent disorientation and difficulty tracking the passage of time, heightened stress responses to previously normal stimuli, emotional volatility, ranging from numbness to sudden panic, difficulty in social interactions, as the brain recalibrates to external stimuli. In interviews collected by advocacy groups, individuals describe returning to normal life, but feeling like strangers to their own senses. Colors seemed brighter, but everything felt overwhelming. Even simple sounds startled me. I wanted to talk to people, but I didn't know how. My thoughts were too loud, too fast, too confused. Scientific research helps explain these experiences. When the brain is deprived of sensory input, neural pathways reorganize. Some areas may strengthen connections internally to compensate, while others, responsible for interpreting external stimuli, weaken. This neuroplastic adaptation allows the brain to survive the deprivation, but it comes at a cost. The external world feels unfamiliar, confusing, or even threatening after prolonged isolation. Psychologist Dr. Craig Haney explains, the human mind is built for interaction and sensory engagement. When these are removed, the brain adapts in ways that may be protective in the short term, but can cause lasting challenges when returning to normal life. Even controlled research participants, who volunteered for sensory deprivation experiments under safe conditions, report lingering effects for weeks. Now imagine these effects magnified under conditions where control, choice, and safety are limited, where the person cannot simply step out. The combination of sensory restriction and isolation creates a perfect storm for long-term psychological strain. And while the research emphasizes that not all effects are permanent, the disruptions to perception, cognition, and emotional stability are significant, documented repeatedly across neuroscience and psychology studies. This is not just theory or speculation, it is a measurable reality for the brain. Functional imaging shows altered activity patterns, stress hormone imbalances, and changes in neural connectivity. The brain itself literally reshapes in response to the absence of sensory input. Real cases, expert insights, and policy intersections. While much of what we've discussed comes from neuroscience research and controlled studies, publicly documented reports reveal real people living through similar conditions in some correctional environments. Organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and the Vera Institute of Justice have compiled accounts where individuals spent prolonged periods in highly restricted, sensory-limited cells. These reports do not name specific facilities in a defamatory way, but they document patterns of experience strikingly similar to laboratory findings. Individuals experiencing vivid internal imagery and hallucination-like experiences, heightened emotional stress, panic episodes, and disorientation, difficulty sleeping, concentrating, and interacting with others after release. Psychologists and legal experts analyze these findings to understand both human impact and policy implications. Dr. Craig Haney, a leading researcher in the psychology of isolation, explains, "What we see repeatedly is that extreme restriction of sensory input can overwhelm cognitive systems. The brain responds predictably, not because someone is weak, but because the human mind depends on stimulation to function normally." Legally, the debate often centers on how these environments fit within constitutional protections and international human rights standards. For instance, the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, CPT, emphasizes that prolonged sensory restriction can constitute conditions incompatible with human dignity, highlighting the need for oversight and regulation. At the intersection of neuroscience and law, one point becomes clear: the brain's response to sensory deprivation is documented, predictable, and measurable. Scientific studies and observational reports consistently show that prolonged restriction can cause profound short-term cognitive and emotional effects and potential long-term consequences. Experts caution that the combination of isolation, restricted sensory input, and lack of social interaction amplifies these effects. It is not merely solitary confinement as popularly imagined, it is a complex neuropsychological experience that challenges the brain at its most fundamental level. By examining both research and real-world reports, this documentary reveals the unseen psychological pressures that extreme sensory-limited conditions can place on the human mind, pressures that are far more intricate, subtle, and dangerous than casual observers might assume. The question is no longer if these conditions affect the brain. The evidence is clear. The question is how we recognize, measure, and respond to these impacts in ways that respect science, law, and human dignity. The silent crisis within the mind. The human brain is a marvel, constantly interpreting, predicting, and connecting. But when the world around it disappears, even briefly, the mind begins to drift into its own universe. Extreme sensory-limited environments are not just empty rooms. They are complex laboratories of the mind, where neural pathways adjust, emotions intensify, and reality itself can feel fragile. Neuroscience shows us that the brain reacts predictably. It generates its own input, creating vivid experiences, heightened stress, and profound disorientation. Reports from research studies, human rights organizations, and expert analyses confirm one truth: the effects are real, measurable, and often long-lasting. What we have uncovered today is not speculation. It is documented science, combined with human experience, illustrating how the mind responds when stripped of the sensory world it depends upon. A deep breath, echoing. In these silent, isolated spaces, the brain becomes both prisoner and creator, constructing its own reality to survive. And when that reality begins to dominate, The mind itself can feel like a cage. Narrator, concluding. The lessons are clear. Our brains need stimulation, connection, and sensory input to remain balanced. When deprived, even temporarily, the consequences are profound. Understanding this is not just academic, it is a glimpse into the fragile, astonishing architecture of the human mind. Like and subscribe for more in-depth documentaries. Watch our related video, Supermax Isolation, the hidden psychology behind solitary confinement. Join the conversation in the comments below.